Poirot and the Birthday Favour, a Poirot Mystery. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The London rain, a persistent drizzle that seemed determined to seep into the very bones of the city, tapped a melancholic rhythm against the window panes of Hercule Poirot's modest flat in Mayfair. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of bergamot and order. Poirot, impeccably dressed in a suit of dove-grey wool that clung to his compact frame like a second skin, sat at a small, immaculate table. Before him lay a single, perfect croissant, its golden crust glistening faintly. He had eaten only half of it, meticulously, with a fork and knife, as was his custom, reserving the remainder for later contemplation. His morning coffee, strong and black, sat untouched beside a plate of perfectly arranged buttered toast. Poirot savoured the quiet. It was a rare commodity these days, especially with the constant hum of London life pressing in. He favoured such moments. The gentle tick-tock of the mantelpiece clock, the soft whir of the radiator, the distant wail of a police siren that was, mercifully, not his case. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the silence to wash over him, a necessary prelude to the intricate mental gymnastics his profession demanded. Then came the sharp, insistent clack of the doorbell, a jarring intrusion into his ordered sanctuary. Poirot sighed, a small, almost imperceptible sound. He would not have answered it had he not been expecting a parcel from his tailor. But the bell rang again, insistently, and this time accompanied by a hesitant knock. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, rising with a smoothness that belied his age. "The world is determined to disturb my morning." He opened the door to find not a delivery boy, but a young man in the livery of the Devenham estates. A house he knew well, though he had not visited it in many years. The lad's face was pale, his fingers fidgeting with the brim of his cap. "Monsieur Poirot? Monsieur Hercule Poirot? Oui, mon garçon. I am he." The young man bowed slightly, thrusting forward a thick, cream-coloured envelope sealed with a heavy wax stamp bearing the Devenham crest, a lion rampant upon a shield. This is for you, Monsieur Poirot, from Sir Alister Devenham himself. He said it was urgent, very urgent." Poirot's keen eyes narrowed. Urgent. That word, so rarely used in polite society, carried a weight. He took the envelope with 2 fingers, as if handling something delicate or potentially hazardous. The paper felt substantial, expensive. "Merci, my boy. You may go." The young man practically fled down the corridor, the door clicking shut behind him with a soft thud. Poirot returned to his table, the quiet replaced by a palpable tension. He examined the envelope. The wax seal was unbroken. The handwriting on the front, bold, confident, unmistakably Sir Alister's, was a slight contrast to the usual formal correspondence of the Devenhams. "Devenham Hall, West Sussex. This evening, for the 21st birthday of my younger son, Peter." He turned the envelope over. There was no return address but a single, small note in the corner. "Please come, Hercule. I feel I must speak to you. I must speak to you." The words resonated with a quiet desperation that the formal letter had not conveyed. Sir Alister Devenham, the towering industrialist whose name was synonymous with success and power in the steel and shipping world, was not one to use such words lightly. Poirot felt the familiar prickle of curiosity, the tiny spark that always ignited when something wasn't quite right beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary situation. He broke the seal with a precise flick of his thumbnail. The letter within was short, written in the same bold hand. "My dear Hercule, the time has come. I have long admired your methods. Peter's 21st birthday party is to be held at Devenham Hall this coming Saturday evening. It would be an honour if you would grace us with your presence. The family is gathering. My wife, Lady Devenham, my 2 sons, Richard and Peter, and a few close friends. Please come. I must speak with you privately before the festivities begin, regarding matters of profound importance. There is a favour I wish to ask, but it must be done in the right manner, at the right time. Do not hesitate to accept. The train leaves Paddington at 10,003 a.m. I shall send a car for you from the station. Jop. Yours most sincerely, Alister Devenham Poirot." Read it twice. A favour. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sir Alister was not a man who asked for favours, he usually gave them. and the mention of profound importance and matters, coupled with the urgency in the note, it suggested something far deeper than a simple social invitation. He recalled the Devenhams from years past, Sir Alister's formidable presence, his wife's quiet grace, the two sons, Richard the elder, serious and perhaps a little overshadowed, and Peter the younger, vibrant and seemingly destined for everything. A favour, Poirot murmured to himself, tracing the elegant script. But it must be done in the right manner, at the right time. A strange phrase. It suggested a carefully choreographed moment, perhaps even a potential conflict. He thought of the old adage, "The best laid schemes o' mice and men gang aft dagly." Sir Alister's scheme, it seemed, was already in motion, and Poirot was being invited to be part of it. He considered the invitation. It was unusual, yes, but not impossible. He had no pressing engagements for Saturday. The quiet morning, the croissant half-eaten, the rain outside, they were all suddenly irrelevant. The puzzle had begun. "Bon," he said decisively, placing the letter carefully on the table beside his untouched coffee. "This is a case of l'urgence. I shall attend." He picked up his telephone. "Oui, mademoiselle? Yes, it is Hercule Poirot. I require a reservation for Saturday afternoon train to Chichester. And yes, the car from the station, merci." As he replaced the receiver, the quiet of the flat was replaced by the quiet hum of anticipation. The rain outside seemed less dreary now. The little grey cells, as he called them, began their gentle, efficient work. Chapter 2. The House of Two Sons. Devenham Hall was not merely a country estate, it was a statement. A vast, imposing edifice of honey-coloured stone, it sprawled across rolling hills like a benevolent giant, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun that had finally broken through the London clouds. The drive was long, winding, and lined with ancient oaks. Poirot, seated in the plush back seat of Sir Alister's waiting car, observed the landscape with his usual quiet intensity. He noted the precise placement of every tree, the manicured lawns, the distant, perfect lines of the formal gardens. It was a world of order, a world that would not tolerate disorder, a world that might find its own order shattered. The house itself was a marvel of Georgian symmetry, with tall windows, a grand portico, and a sense of solid, enduring power. As Poirot stepped from the car, he felt the familiar weight of expectation settle upon him. The air was thick with the scent of roses and anticipation. Sir Alister Devenham greeted him at the door, a broad smile splitting his face, though Poirot noted the slight tension around his eyes. He was a man who commanded attention, tall, imposing, with a shock of silver hair and a presence that filled the grand entrance hall. He clasped Poirot's hands warmly. "Hercule, my dear Hercule, you honour us beyond measure. I am so glad you could come." His voice was hearty, but beneath it, Poirot sensed a current of nervous energy. "Sir Alister, your letter was intriguing," Poirot replied smoothly, his own smile carefully calibrated. "I trust I arrive at a convenient time." "Convenient? Mon cher, it is perfect. Come, let me introduce you." He ushered Poirot inside, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind them, sealing them into a world of polished wood, thick carpets, and hushed conversation. The entrance hall was a hive of activity. Servants moved with silent efficiency, carrying trays of champagne flutes and canapes. Guests, men in evening dress, women in gowns that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers, mingled, their laughter and conversation, a pleasant background hum. Poirot felt the familiar buzz of social gathering, the subtle assessments, the unspoken hierarchies, the quiet currents of gossip. Sir Alister guided him towards two young men standing near a grand piano. The first was Peter Devenham. He was everything his father's letter had suggested, vibrant, handsome, radiating an easy confidence. He wore a tailored suit that seemed to fit him perfectly, his dark hair neatly styled, his eyes bright with youthful excitement. He was the picture of the successful, favoured son. "Peter, my boy, come here, my dear fellow, let me introduce you to Monsieur Poirot, the famous Monsieur Poirot, who has solved cases that would have left Scotland Yard scratching their heads." Peter turned, his smile wide and genuine. "Monsieur Poirot, it's an absolute pleasure. I've heard so much about you. My father speaks of you with such respect." He shook Poirot's hand firmly, his grip warm and confident. "I'm thrilled you could come." Poirot inclined his head. "The pleasure is entirely mine, Monsieur Peter. Your birthday is indeed a momentous occasion." Before Poirot could say more, a second figure stepped forward. Richard Devenham. He was the polar opposite of his younger brother. Where Peter was open and energetic, Richard was reserved, almost withdrawn. His dark hair was slightly longer than the fashion, framing a face that was intelligent but shadowed by a deep seriousness. His suit was impeccable, but he held himself with a stiffness that suggested he was not entirely comfortable in the festive atmosphere. "Richard," Sir Alister said, his voice softening slightly, "this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot, a dear friend and a most accomplished detective." Richard offered a polite nod, his handshake firm but brief. His eyes, a deep, watchful grey, met Poirot's for a moment. There was no warmth there, only a quiet intensity, a hint of something deeply held beneath the surface. He said nothing. "Ah, Richard!" Sir Alister clapped his elder son on the shoulder, his voice bright but slightly forced. "We were just talking about the car, the vintage Bentley. It's a beauty, isn't it? Peter's birthday present, a little something to mark the occasion." He beamed at Peter. Peter laughed, a rich, easy sound. "It's absolutely perfect, Father. I've been dreaming of that car for years." Poirot observed the exchange. The father's pride was palpable, directed solely towards Peter. Richard stood slightly apart, his expression unreadable, but Poirot saw the faintest tightening around his eyes as he glanced at his brother. It was not a look of envy, exactly. It was something deeper, more complex. A quiet, simmering resentment. Lady Devenham joined them then. She was a woman of great beauty and grace, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held a quiet wisdom. Her gown was simple but elegant, her movements serene. She offered Poirot a warm, genuine smile. "Monsieur Poirot, we are so glad you could come. I have heard so much about your work. Sir Alister speaks of you with great admiration." Her voice was soft, her tone courteous, but Poirot sensed a watchfulness in her eyes, a subtle alertness that suggested she had seen more than she let on. "Madame Devenham," Poirot bowed slightly, "the pleasure is mine. Your husband has been most kind." Sir Alister clapped his hands together. "Right, let's get you settled, Hercule. We have a room prepared for you." And then, the party. "The main hall will be open for dinner and dancing after the toast to Peter. You'll find everything you need." He turned to Richard. "Richard, show Monsieur Poirot to his room, would you? I need to speak with the chef about the main course." Richard gave a curt nod. "Of course, Father." He turned towards the stairs, his posture stiff. Poirot followed him, noting the way Richard's shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. The tension between the brothers was not just in the words, it was in the space between them, a palpable current of unspoken history. As they walked down the wide, carpeted hallway, Richard finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "My father, he is very excited for Peter's birthday. It's a big day." "Indeed," Poirot replied smoothly. "He seems very proud." "Are you, Richard paused at a door, his hand on the knob. "Pride can be a powerful thing, Monsieur Poirot. It can also be a burden." He opened the door, revealing a spacious, tastefully appointed bedroom. "Your room? I trust it is to your liking?" "It is perfect, thank you," Poirot said, stepping inside. He turned to Richard. "You will join us for dinner, I trust?" Richard's gaze lingered on Poirot for a moment, then flickered away. I have some things to see to, but I shall be there." He gave a stiff nod and turned, walking quickly down the hall towards the opposite end. Poirot watched him go, his little grey cells already humming with the subtle clues he had observed, the way Richard's posture spoke of restraint, the flicker of resentment in his eyes when Peter was praised, the quiet intensity that contrasted so sharply with Peter's open joy. The house of two sons was not a house of harmony, it was a house built on a fault line, and Poirot, the guest invited to witness the birthday, had just stepped onto the edge. Chapter 3. A Whisper in the Garden. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, Poirot sought a moment of quiet contemplation. The house was a whirlwind of activity. Servants bustling with final preparations for dinner, guests mingling in the drawing-room, the distant sound of music drifting from the ballroom. The air was thick with the scent of roses and anticipation. Poirot stepped out onto a terrace overlooking the expansive gardens. The cool evening air felt like a balm after the stuffiness of the house. He walked slowly along the gravel path, the crunch under his polished shoes a soothing rhythm. He paused by a rosebed, its velvety petals glowing in the fading light. He was contemplating the intricate beauty of a single bloom when he heard voices, low, urgent, and edged with anger, drifting from behind a clump of hollyhocks. He froze, his senses sharpening instantly. Voices, not the usual guests. He moved silently, gliding between the flower beds like a shadow, until he reached a point where he could see the source of the sound without being seen himself. Sir Alister Devenham stood near a stone bench, his back to the garden path, his posture rigid with tension. He was speaking to Richard, who stood facing him, his expression a mask of controlled fury. The words were hushed, but Poirot, with his sharp hearing and keen attention to detail, caught fragments that cut through the evening air like shards of glass. "Must understand, Richard, it's not about money," Sir Alister began, his voice tight with emotion. "Peter is the heir, in all but name." Richard's reply was a low, harsh whisper, laced with bitterness. "In all but name? You made it all but name. Every decision, every word, every favour, all for Peter. What about me? What about my work, my life?" Sir Alister's voice rose slightly, a note of frustration entering his tone. "You are my son, Richard. You have everything you need. But Peter, he has the vision, the energy. He is the one who will carry on the business." "Carry on the business?" Richard spat the words out, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "This isn't about the business, father. It's about favoritism. You've made it clear for years. I am second to him." Poirot felt a jolt. Favoritism. The word echoed in his mind. He saw Richard's clenched fists, the way he seemed to physically recoil from his father's words. Sir Alister, though standing tall, seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of his son's accusation. "It's not favoritism," Sir Alister insisted, his voice low but fierce. "It's merit. Peter deserves it. He has always been special." "Special?" Richard's laugh was short, bitter. "You mean he's the one you've always loved more? The one you've always wanted?" He took a step closer to his father, his eyes blazing. "Well, this favoritism has gone on long enough. It ends tonight." Sir Alister seemed to flinch. "Richard, don't say things you don't mean." "I mean every word," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. This birthday party, it's the final straw. You've given him the car, the attention, everything. Well, he doesn't get it all, not anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Before Sir Alister could respond, Richard turned abruptly, his face a mask of cold fury. He strode away from the bench, disappearing into the shadowed path beyond the rose garden, leaving his father standing alone, his shoulders slumped, staring after him. Poirot remained perfectly still, his heart pounding with the force of the revelation he had just witnessed. The final straw. The words echoed in his mind. The birthday party, the vintage car, the deep-seated resentment that had simmered for years. He watched Sir Alister for a moment longer. The industrialist seemed to gather himself, his face hardening into its usual mask of authority, but Poirot saw the tremor in his hands as he straightened his tie. As Sir Alister walked briskly back towards the house, Poirot finally moved, stepping out from behind the hollyhocks. He returned to the terrace, the scent of roses suddenly seeming cloying. The quiet garden was now filled with the echoes of a bitter argument, a family secret laid bare in the fading light. He had heard it all. Inheritance. Favoritism. The final straw. Richard's words, "He doesn't get it all, not any more," were not merely angry words. They were a threat, a promise of action. Poirot felt the familiar chill of a mystery unfolding, a puzzle with its first, crucial piece now in place. "Ah, mon Dieu," he murmured to himself, his fingers absently tracing the edge of his moustache. The house of two sons is not just built on a fault line, it is about to collapse. Chapter 4. A Toast to the Birthday Boy. The dining room at Devenham Hall was a vision of opulence and celebration. Long tables draped in snowy linen, gleaming silver, crystal glasses sparkling under the soft light of a massive chandelier. The air hummed with the clink of cutlery, the murmur of conversation, and the low thrum of a string quartet playing classical music in the corner. Candles flickered in their holders, casting dancing shadows on the walls adorned with family portraits. Poirot sat at a place of honour near Sir Alister's head, observing the scene with his customary quiet intensity. He noted the way Sir Alister beamed with pride as he surveyed his guests. Peter, resplendent in a new suit, his face alight with happiness; Lady Devenham, her expression serene but with a slight tension around her eyes; Richard, seated a few places away, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed on his untouched glass of wine. The meal proceeded with a fine, quiet grace. The food was exquisite, the service impeccable. Conversation flowed easily, laced with laughter and toasts to Peter's health and future. Poirot ate sparingly, his attention focused on the subtle currents beneath the surface. As the main course was cleared, Sir Alister rose to his feet. The room fell into a hushed silence, all eyes turning to him. He held up his glass, his face radiant with joy. "My dear friends," he began, his voice booming with genuine warmth, "we gather tonight to celebrate not just the 21st birthday of our beloved son Peter, but the beginning of a new chapter for him, and for our family. It is with immense pride that I present him with a gift that symbolizes this new beginning, a token of my faith in his future and my belief in his potential." He paused dramatically, a smile spreading across his face. "Peter, my boy, you have always been the one who sees the big picture, who has the spark, the drive. You are the heir apparent to everything we have built, not just in name, but in spirit." He turned to a servant standing discreetly near the door. "Bring it in, John." A young man entered carrying a small, elegant box covered with a velvet cloth. Sir Alister took it from him, his hands trembling slightly with emotion. With great care he lifted the lid. Inside, resting on white satin, was a key, a simple polished brass key. But beneath it lay a small silver plaque engraved with the Devenham crest. Poirot's sharp eyes caught the words, "For Peter," on his 21st birthday. Sir Alister placed the key in Peter's hand. "This key," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "opens the door to a vintage Bentley 3.5-litre Tourer, one of the finest examples of its kind. It has been restored with the utmost care. It is yours, Peter, a symbol of your place in this family and the future that awaits you." A wave of applause swept through the room. Peter's face lit up with pure joy. He stood, his eyes glistening, and embraced his father warmly. "Thank you, father. Thank you so much." Sir Alister beamed, patting his son on the back. "It is the least I could do." Poirot watched Richard. As the applause died down, he saw Richard raise his glass. He clapped politely, a small, formal gesture, but his eyes were cold, hard as flint. They held no warmth, only a deep, simmering resentment. His gaze lingered on Peter's face for a moment, then flickered to his father, and Poirot saw the faintest tightening of his jaw, a micro-expression of fury barely concealed. "He doesn't get it all. Not any more," the words echoed in Poirot's mind. Not any more. The gift was not just a present, it was the final act of favoritism, the culmination of years of being overlooked. And Richard had heard it all. The toast continued, but Poirot's attention was fixed on Richard. He saw him take a small sip of his drink, his expression carefully neutral, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. The quiet intensity of the younger son was now a palpable force in the room, a silent storm gathering beneath the surface of the celebration. As the meal progressed, Poirot observed the subtle shifts. Lady Devenham's quiet sigh as she watched her husband lavish attention on Peter, Richard's stiff posture as he made a brief, curt remark to a guest, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. The air was thick with unspoken words, a tension that seemed to vibrate in the very air. The evening proceeded, but Poirot knew the calm was merely the eye of the storm. The final straw had been laid. And the man who had spoken those chilling words, "He doesn't get it all, not any more," was now seated at the table, his eyes fixed on the glass of wine in front of him. Chapter 5. The Death in the Study. The party moved to the drawing-room after dinner, a more intimate space for conversation and dancing. Candles burned low, casting long shadows across the plush carpets. The air was warm with the scent of perfume, expensive cigars, and the lingering aroma of brandy from the decanters on the sideboard. Poirot, feeling the need for a quiet moment away from the bustle, excused himself and wandered towards the library. He intended to step in for a brief moment, perhaps to admire the bookshelves, but the door was slightly ajar. He paused, hearing muffled voices inside. Sir Alister's voice, low and urgent. "Must be handled properly, Richard. It's not just about the car. It's about the future." Sir Alister's words were hushed, filled with a strange gravity that didn't fit the celebratory mood of the party. "I know what I'm doing, Father," Richard replied, his voice tight. "You don't have to worry about it." Poirot hesitated, then stepped into the doorway, clearing his throat softly. "Pardon me, Sir Alister. I thought I heard you in here." Sir Alister turned, his face a mask of surprise. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, I was just discussing something with Richard." He forced a smile. Come in. We were just talking about the party." Poirot entered, nodding politely. "A very fine party, Sir Alister. Your son Peter is indeed fortunate to have such a generous father." Sir Alister chuckled, though it sounded a little forced. "He's my only son who deserves it. Richard, why don't you go join the others? I need to speak with Monsieur Poirot about something important." Richard gave a curt nod. "Of course, Father." He turned and left the room, his footsteps fading down the hall. Sir Alister walked over to his desk, which was covered in papers and books. "A most interesting man you are, Monsieur Poirot. I have heard many things about your work. You have a unique way of seeing things." Poirot inclined his head. "I merely observe, Sir Alister. It is often the small details that hold the key to the larger puzzle." Sir Alister nodded slowly. "Yes, small details." He picked up a photograph from the desk. A picture of Peter as a young boy, smiling broadly in front of a bicycle. This was taken when he was about 8. He was always so full of life, so bright. He looked at Poirot, his eyes holding a strange intensity. "I have been thinking, perhaps it is time I spoke to you about something that has been troubling me for some time." Before Poirot could respond, a loud scream shattered the quiet. It came from the direction of the drawing-room, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Sir Alister froze, his hand tightening on the photograph. "My God," he gasped, "that's my wife!" Without another word, Poirot was out the door, racing down the hall towards the drawing-room. He could hear the sounds of commotion, the clatter of chairs, the frantic voices of guests. He burst into the drawing-room to find Lady Devenham standing near the fireplace, her face pale, her hands shaking, pointing a trembling finger towards the library door. A group of guests had gathered, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. "Sir Alister!" one of the guests, a woman Poirot recognized as Lady Penelope Thorne, cried out. He's in the study." Poirot pushed through the crowd, his heart pounding. He entered the library, where the scene was already unfolding. Sir Alister Devenham sat slumped over his desk, his head resting on a pile of papers, his face pale and still. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. The local inspector, a man named Inspector Croft, who had been invited as a guest, stood near the desk, his face grim. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice tight with concern. This is serious. Sir Alister's dead. I think it's a heart attack." Poirot knelt beside the desk, his eyes scanning the scene with meticulous care. He saw the glass of brandy beside Sir Alister's hand, the empty decanter on the desk, the photograph still clutched in the man's fingers. But he also noticed something else, the faint, almost imperceptible scent of bitter almonds. Bitter almonds, Poirot thought to himself, his mind racing. Cyanide. He looked at Inspector Croft. "Inspector, I must insist that this is not a heart attack. It is murder." Croft frowned, his expression sceptical. "Murder? Nonsense. The man was in good health. It's a heart attack, plain and simple." Poirot rose slowly, his gaze fixed on the brandy glass. "The scent of bitter almonds, Inspector. Cyanide. This man was poisoned." Croft hesitated, then bent closer to the glass. He sniffed cautiously. I don't smell anything, but it is possible." He straightened up, his expression turning serious. "Very well, Monsieur Poirot. You are the expert. We'll treat this as murder. Poirot nodded, his mind already working on the puzzle. The brandy glass, the photograph, a decanter. He had seen the photograph, the one of Peter as a child, clutched in Sir Alister's hand. It was the same one he had been holding when Poirot entered the room. He was holding this photograph, Poirot thought, and he was about to speak to me about something important. The timing was significant. Sir Alister had been on the verge of confiding in him, perhaps about Richard's resentment, about his own fears. And then he had been poisoned. Poirot looked around the room again. He saw a small, almost imperceptible smudge on the stopper of the decanter, a faint, oily residue, and he noticed that the photograph of Peter was not where it had been before. It was now lying face down on the desk, slightly off-centre. The photograph was moved, Poirot realised. It was significant. He turned to Croft. "Inspector, I must examine this room further. There are clues here that need to be preserved." Croft nodded, his expression serious now. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. But please, be careful. This is a delicate situation." Poirot knelt again, his eyes taking in every detail. The brandy glass, no fingerprints, clean. The decanter stopper, the oily residue. The photograph, moved, and the scent of bitter almonds lingering in the air. Cyanide, he thought again, administered through the brandy. But how? And when? The party was over. The celebration had ended in death, and Poirot knew with a sinking certainty that he was now part of the puzzle, the only one who could solve it. Chapter 6. Poirot takes an interest. The library was now a crime scene, but Poirot moved through it with the quiet precision of a surgeon. Inspector Croft stood by the door, his face pale and worried, while the guests, including Lady Devenham, Peter and Richard, hovered nervously in the drawing-room, their expressions a mixture of shock and confusion. Poirot ignored them, focusing entirely on the scene before him. He knelt beside Sir Alister's desk, his eyes scanning every detail with the intensity of a man who had spent a lifetime searching for the smallest clue. The brandy glass was clean, as if it had been deliberately wiped. But Poirot could still see the faintest trace of moisture on the rim, the ghost of a drink that had been poisoned. He held it up to the light, his eyes narrowing. No fingerprints. Deliberate. He turned to the decanter. It was filled with brandy, but it was the stopper that caught his attention. There was a faint, almost invisible smudge on it, a tiny mark, like an oil smudge. Poirot's mind raced. Oily residue. What could have caused that? He noticed something else. The photograph of Peter, the one he had seen Sir Alister holding, was now lying face down on the desk, slightly off-centre. It had been moved. Poirot picked it up gently. The edges were clean, as if it had been carefully placed there after Sir Alister's death. Why move the photograph? Poirot wondered. It was significant. It was a symbol of his affection for Peter. He looked around the room again. The study was tidy, but not overly so. There were books on the shelves, papers on the desk, and a small ornate clock ticking softly on the mantelpiece. But there was one thing that stood out, a single perfect rose lying on the floor near the door. It was a deep red, its petals still fresh. Poirot picked it up, turning it over in his hand. A rose from the garden. The scent of roses filled the air. The same scent that had been in the garden when he had overheard Sir Alister and Richard arguing. The garden, Poirot thought. The rose? It was picked recently. He placed the rose back on the desk, then turned his attention to the decanter stopper again. Oily residue. Who would have oil on their fingers? He remembered a guest, a young man named Mr. Alan Carter, who had been seen pouring himself a drink earlier. Poirot recalled his hands. They had been slightly greasy from handling the car's engine. The brandy was poisoned, Poirot realised. But how? He looked at the stopper again. The residue? It was on the stopper, not the glass. So the poison was added to the decanter itself, not the glass. That meant the poisoner had access to the decanter before Sir Alister poured his drink. Who would have had access to the decanter, Poirot thought. The host, of course. But also anyone who had been in the library before Sir Alister retired here for his nightly brandy. He looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was almost 10,003 p.m. Sir Alister had been poisoned after he had finished dinner and before the party had moved to the drawing-room. The timing, Poirot mused. Sir Alister retired to his study for his nightly brandy, Around 10:30 p.m., he would have poured himself a drink, then died. He looked at Sir Alister's body again. The man was slumped over the desk, his head resting on the papers. He was writing something when he died. Poirot noticed a half-finished letter on the desk, a letter addressed to Peter. A letter, Poirot thought. Post to Peter. About what? He turned to Inspector Croft, who had been watching him with growing unease. Inspector, I need to examine the decanter more closely, and I need to speak with everyone who was in the library before Sir Alister died. Croft nodded. Of course, Monsieur Poirot. But, are you sure it's not just a heart attack? It's been a long night. Poirot cut him off gently but firmly. All, Inspector. The scent of bitter almonds is unmistakable. Cyanide. This was murder. And I will find the killer. He turned back to the desk, his mind working furiously. The photograph. The rose. The oily residue. And the timing. He had the pieces of the puzzle, but he needed to put them together. The photograph was moved, he thought again. It was a symbol of Sir Alister's affection for Peter. And Richard was the one who said, he doesn't get it all. Not any more. Poirot felt a chill run down his spine. Richard had been in the study with his father just before he died. He had been the last one to see him alive. He looked at the decanter stopper again, the oily residue. It was on the stopper. So the poisoner had handled the stopper, and they had oil on their fingers. Poirot's mind turned to Richard. Richard had been working on his father's car earlier in the day. He would have had oil on his hands. It fits, Poirot thought. Richard had motive, opportunity, and the means. He needed proof. He needed to confirm what he suspected. He turned to Inspector Croft. Inspector, I need to speak with Richard Devenham. Now. Croft hesitated. He's been very upset. He's in the drawing-room with his mother and brother. Oui, Poirot said, his voice calm but insistent. I must speak with him. It is urgent. Croft nodded. Very well, I'll bring him here. As Croft left the room, Poirot knelt again beside Sir Alister's desk. He picked up the photograph of Peter and looked at it closely. The boy was smiling, but his eyes held a look of quiet intensity, a look that reminded Poirot of Richard. Richard, Poirot thought. He has always been overshadowed. He placed the photograph back on the desk, then turned to the rose. The rose from the garden. He remembered the argument he had overheard. Sir Alister and Richard arguing in the garden. They were arguing about the garden, about the roses. Richard was in the garden, Poirot realized. He picked the rose, and he brought it to his father. But why? He looked at the decanter stopper again, at the oily residue. The rose was picked from the garden, but Richard would have had oil on his hands from working on the car. It all fit together. Poirot felt a wave of certainty wash over him. Richard Devenham is the killer, but he needed to be sure. He needed to confirm the timeline to make sure Richard had the opportunity. The alibi, Poirot thought. Richard said he was playing billiards with his cousin, but if the cousin stepped away during the crucial minutes, he remembered the maid's report. She had seen Richard near the study shortly before the body was found. The timing, Poirot thought. It all lines up. He looked at Sir Alister's body, then at the brandy glass, the decanter, the photograph. The puzzle is almost complete. Poirot stood up, his mind clear and focused. The little grey cells were working at full speed. I will find the truth, he thought, and I will bring it to light. Chapter 7. Suspicions and Statements. Inspector Croft returned with Richard Devenham trailing behind him, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with grief that seemed almost too perfect. He stood in the doorway of the library, his posture stiff, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Monsieur Poirot, Croft said, his voice low. Richard is here. Poirot turned to Richard, his gaze steady and calm. Monsieur Devenham, thank you for coming. I need to ask you a few questions. Richard nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course, Monsieur Poirot. Anything I can do. First, Poirot began, his tone gentle but firm, could you tell me where you were between 9045 and 10,003 p.m.? Richard hesitated, his eyes flickering to the floor. I was in the drawing-room with my cousin Alan. We were playing billiards. Billiards? Poirot asked. You were playing billiards with Mr. Carter? Yes, Richard said, his voice gaining a little strength. We were playing for about an hour. Alan was here, and he can confirm it. Poirot nodded slowly. And when did you leave the billiards room? About 10,005, I think, Richard replied. I went to the study to speak with my father. He'd been in there since dinner. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. He said he went to speak with his father at 10:15, but Sir Alister had been poisoned after 10:00 p.m. during his nightly brandy. Did you see your father in the study? Poirot asked. Richard's expression darkened. Yes. He was sitting at his desk, writing something. He looked upset. Upset, Poirot thought. He was upset about Richard, about the argument. Poirot nodded. And after that? I left him alone. I went back to the drawing room, Richard said, his voice tight. And you didn't return to the study? No, Richard said firmly. I didn't. Poirot turned his gaze to Inspector Croft. Inspector, did you speak with Mr. Carter about this? Croft nodded. Yes. He confirmed that he and Richard were playing billiards. They were together for most of the time. But he did say that he stepped away for a few minutes around 10:15 to get a drink. Poirot's eyes widened slightly. Stepped away for a few minutes. That was precisely the window of opportunity. He turned back to Richard. You were playing billiards with Mr. Carter, but you said you left the room at 10:15 to speak with your father. Was that before or after he stepped away? Richard looked confused. Before, I think. I went to the study right after we started playing. No, Poirot thought. He was lying. He said he left the billiards room at 10:05, but Mr. Carter stepped away at the same time. That means Richard had the opportunity. Poirot turned to Croft. Inspector, please speak with Mr. Carter again. Ask him exactly when he stepped away. Croft nodded. I'll do that, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot turned back to Richard. Now, Monsieur Devenham, could you tell me about the photograph on your father's desk, the one of Peter? Richard's face paled. I don't know what you mean. The photograph of Peter as a child, Poirot pressed. It was moved from its place when Sir Alister died. Why would it have been moved? Richard's eyes darted away. I don't know. I didn't touch it. He's lying, Poirot thought. He moved it. He wanted to make sure his father knew he had seen it. Poirot turned to Croft. Inspector, I need to speak with the maid who was in the house. She reported seeing Richard near the study shortly before the body was found. Croft nodded. I'll have her brought in. As Croft left the room, Poirot turned back to Richard. Monsieur Devenham, I must ask you one more thing. Did you have any reason to harm your father? Richard's face hardened. No, I loved my father. He was a good man. Loved him, Poirot thought, but he resented him. The words from the garden echoed in his mind. He doesn't get it all. Not any more. Poirot looked at Richard's hands. They were clean, but he could still see the faintest trace of oil on the edge of his thumb. The oily residue, Poirot realized. Richard had oil on his hands from working on the car. He used it to poison the decanter. He turned to Croft as he returned with the maid, a young woman named Emily. Miss Emily, please tell Monsieur Poirot what you saw. Emily's voice trembled. I was carrying a tray of tea through the hall. I saw Mr. Richard near the study door. He was standing there for a moment, then he went inside. I thought he was going to speak with Sir Alister. He went inside, Poirot thought. He poisoned the brandy. Poirot turned to Richard. You were near the study door at 10:05. You went inside, and you poisoned the brandy. Richard's face went white. I didn't do it. I swear. He's denying it, Poirot thought. But the evidence is clear. Poirot turned to Croft. Inspector, I believe we have our killer. It was Richard Devenham. Croft looked at him, his face pale. Monsieur Poirot, are you sure? Oui, Poirot said firmly. The timing, the opportunity, the means. Richard had oil on his hands from working on the car. He used it to poison the decanter. He went into the study at 10:05, poisoned the brandy, and left. He knew his father would be in there for his nightly brandy. Croft looked at Richard, his expression grim. Richard Devenham, you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Alister Devenham. Richard's face crumpled. No, I didn't do it. I loved him. Poirot shook his head. You did it because you resented him. Because he favoured Peter over you, because he had given Peter the car, the attention, everything. You couldn't bear it any more. Richard's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't just the car, it was everything. He never saw me. I was always invisible. Poirot felt a pang of sadness. Not greed, he thought. Just love unequally given. He looked at Sir Alister's body, then at Richard, who was being led away by Croft. A family torn apart by love, not by money. Chapter 8. The Question of the Photograph. Poirot sat alone in the library, the quiet of the room, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded moments before. The body of Sir Alister Devenham lay on a stretcher, being carried out by the coroner's men. Inspector Croft stood near the door, his face pale with shock and confusion. Poirot turned his attention back to the desk. He picked up the photograph of Peter as a child again, turning it over in his hands. The image was clear, the boy smiling broadly, his eyes bright with innocence. Why move this photograph, Poirot thought. It was significant. And however, he remembered the argument he had overheard in the garden. Sir Alister and Richard arguing about favoritism, about Peter being the heir in all but name. The photograph was a symbol of that favoritism. Sir Alister held it in his hand when I entered the room, Poirot recalled. He was about to speak to me about something important. He was going to tell me about Richard, about the resentment. He looked at the photograph again. It was moved after Sir Alister died. So the killer moved it. Why? Poirot's mind raced. The killer wanted to make sure Sir Alister knew he had seen it. He wanted him to know that Richard had been in the room, that he had seen the photograph. Richard, Poirot thought. He moved the photograph to remind his father of the favoritism. He placed the photograph back on the desk, then turned to the rose lying on the floor. The rose from the garden. He remembered the argument in the garden. Sir Alister and Richard arguing about the roses. Richard picked the rose, Poirot realized. He brought it to his father as a symbol of something. But what? The rose was red, a symbol of love or passion. But Richard didn't love his father in that way. It was a symbol of resentment, Poirot thought. The rose was a reminder of the garden argument. He picked it to show his father that he had been in the garden, that he had heard the argument. Poirot looked at the decanter stopper again. Oily residue. Richard had oil on his hands from working on the car. He used it to poison the brandy. He had opportunity, Poirot thought. He was in the study at 10,005. He poisoned the brandy. He left. He looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was just past 10,003 p.m. Sir Alister poured his drink, drank it, and died within minutes. Poirot's mind was now clear. The puzzle was complete. The photograph, he thought. It was the key, the symbol of the favoritism that drove Richard to murder. He turned to Inspector Croft. "Inspector, I need to speak with Lady Devenham." "Privately." Croft nodded. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot left the library and walked down the hall to the drawing-room. Lady Devenham was sitting in a chair by the fireplace, her face pale, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up as Poirot entered. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly. I'm so sorry about Sir Alister." Poirot sat down beside her, his voice gentle. "Madame Devenham, I need to ask you a few questions." Lady Devenham looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. Anything. Did your husband ever favour Peter over Richard?" Lady Devenham hesitated, then sighed. "Yes, he always did. Peter he was so full of life, so easy. Richard was quiet, serious. Sir Alister thought Peter would carry on the business, that he had the vision. Did you ever talk to him about it?" Lady Devenham shook her head. "No, I was afraid to. I knew Richard resented it. I feared for his heart. But I never thought he would do something like this." Poirot nodded. "And what about the photograph, the one of Peter as a child?" Lady Devenham's eyes widened. "The photograph? Sir Alister loved that picture. He kept it on his desk. Did Richard ever mention it?" Lady Devenham looked down. "Yeah, he did. A few times. He said it was a symbol of how much his father loved Peter." Exactly, Poirot thought. Richard used it as a weapon. Poirot stood up. "Thank you, Madame Devenham. You've been very helpful." As he left the drawing-room, Poirot felt a deep sadness. a family torn apart by love unequally given. It was a tragedy far more profound than any murder. Chapter 9. The Matter of the Brandy. Poirot stood in the library, the scent of bitter almonds still lingering in the air. He had already questioned Lady Devenham, and now he turned his attention back to the decanter and the brandy glass. He picked up the brandy glass again, holding it up to the light. No fingerprints. Clean. He looked at the decanter. The stopper was still in place, but the faint oily residue was clearly visible. The oil, Poirot thought. It's the key. He remembered the maid's report. She had seen Richard near the study door at 10,015. He also remembered Mr. Carter's statement. He had stepped away from the billiards room around that time. Richard went into the study at 10,015, Poirot mused. He poisoned the brandy, then left. But how did he know Sir Alister would be there? He looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was almost 10,003 p.m. Sir Alister retired to his study for his nightly brandy at 10,000 p.m. Poirot knew that from his own observations. Richard knew his father's routine, Poirot realized. He knew Sir Alister would be in the study at 10,000 p.m. He waited until 10,015 to poison the brandy, so he would have time to return to the billiards room before his alibi was tested. Poirot turned to Inspector Croft, who had been standing silently near the door. "Inspector, did you speak with Mr. Carter about the timing?" Croft nodded. "Yes." He said he stepped away from the billiards table at 10,005 to get a drink. Richard was still in the room when he left. Richard was still in the room, Poirot thought. But he wasn't playing billiards. He was in the study, poisoning the brandy. He looked at the decanter stopper again. The oily residue. He remembered seeing Richard's hands earlier. They were clean, but he could see a faint trace of oil on his thumb. Richard had oil on his hands from working on the car, Poirot said aloud. He used it to poison the decanter. He turned to Croft. "Inspector, I need to know who was in the library before Sir Alister died." Croft frowned. "I don't know, but I'll check with the staff. And I need to know if anyone else had access to the decanter." Croft hesitated. Well, Sir Alister usually kept the brandy in his study. It was his personal decanter, so only he and Richard would have had access, Poirot thought. Richard poisoned it. He picked up the rose from the floor again. The rose from the garden. He remembered the argument in the garden, Sir Alister and Richard arguing about the roses. Richard picked the rose, Poirot realized. He brought it to his father as a symbol of the argument. He looked at the photograph on the desk, the photograph of Peter. He had seen it in Sir Alister's hand when he entered the room. Richard moved it after Sir Alister died to remind him of the favoritism. It was all about the favoritism, Poirot thought. Richard couldn't bear it any more. He turned to Croft. "Inspector, I believe we have our killer. It was Richard Devenham." Croft looked at him, his face pale. "But he has an alibi. His cousin says they were playing billiards together." Poirot shook his head. "The alibi is false." Mr. Carter stepped away from the billiards room at 10,017. That's when Richard went into the study and poisoned the brandy. He returned to the billiards room before Mr. Carter came back. Croft nodded slowly. "I'll check that with Mr. Carter." Poirot turned back to the desk, his mind now focused on the final piece of the puzzle, the brandy. He looked at the decanter stopper again. The oily residue was from Richard's hands. He used oil to poison the brandy, Poirot thought, because he knew it would be hard to find. He placed the rose back on the desk. The rose was a symbol of the garden argument. The photograph was a symbol of the favoritism. And the oil, it was the means. Poirot felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The puzzle was complete. Richard Devenham, he thought. He killed his father because he couldn't bear the favoritism. Chapter 10. The Alibi That Slips. Inspector Croft returned to the library, his face pale with shock. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice tight. "I spoke with Mr. Carter. He admitted that he stepped away from the billiards room for about 10 minutes at 10:15. Richard was still in the room when he left." Poirot nodded slowly. "Oui. And Richard was not playing billiards during that time." Croft hesitated. "So, Richard's alibi is false?" "Exactement," Poirot said, his voice calm. Richard was not in the billiards room at 10,005. He was in the study, poisoning the brandy. He turned to Croft. "And I need to speak with Richard again. Now." Croft nodded. "I'll have him brought here." As Croft left the room, Poirot stood by the desk, his mind racing. The timing was perfect. Richard had poisoned the brandy at 10,005, then returned to the billiards room before Mr. Carter came back. He had covered his tracks perfectly, but there was one thing he needed to confirm: the oil. He looked at the decanter stopper again. The oily residue was from Richard's hands. But how did he know Sir Alistair would be in the study? Richard knew his father's routine, Poirot thought. Sir Alistair retired to his study for his nightly brandy at 10,000 p.m. Richard waited until 10,015 to poison the brandy, so he would have time to return to the billiards room. He turned to the door as Croft returned with Richard. Richard stood before Poirot, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with grief. "Monsieur Poirot," he said softly, I'm so sorry about my father." Poirot looked at him, his gaze steady. "Monsieur Devenham, I need to ask you one more question. Did you poison the brandy?" Richard's face went white. I didn't do it, I swear. He's denying it," Poirot thought. "But he's lying." Poirot turned to Croft. "Inspector, could you show Monsieur Devenham the decanter stopper?" Croft nodded and brought over the decanter. He held it up so Richard could see the stopper. Richard looked at it, his eyes widening. That's my oil." He admits it, Poirot thought. The oil on the stopper is from his hands. Poirot turned back to Richard. "You had oil on your hands from working on the car. You used it to poison the brandy. You went into the study at 10,005, poisoned the brandy, and left." Richard's face crumpled. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to know that I was angry." He did it, Poirot thought. He killed his father because of the favoritism. Poirot turned to Croft. "Inspector, arrest Richard Devenham for the murder of Sir Alistair Devenham." Croft nodded slowly. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot." As Croft led Richard away, Poirot felt a deep sadness. Not greed, he thought, just love unequally given. He turned to the desk, looking at the photograph of Peter, the rose on the floor, and the decanter stopper with its faint oily residue. The puzzle is complete, he thought, and the truth is now known. Chapter 11. A Mother's Silence. Poirot found Lady Devenham alone in the drawing-room, sitting by the fireplace, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with tears. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly. I'm so sorry about Sir Alistair." Poirot sat down beside her. "Madame Devenham, I need to ask you a few questions." Lady Devenham nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. Anything. Did you know Richard resented his father for favouring Peter?" Lady Devenham hesitated, then sighed. "Yes, I knew. For years. I tried to talk to Sir Alistair about it, but he wouldn't listen. He said Peter was the heir, that he had the vision. Did you ever feel guilty for not speaking up?" Lady Devenham looked down at her hands. Yes. Every day. I knew Richard was hurting. I saw the way he looked at his brother, the way he carried himself, but I was afraid. I was afraid of causing more pain." Poirot nodded slowly. "And you never told Sir Alistair?" Lady Devenham shook her head. "Oh, I was afraid. I thought it would only make things worse." She was silent, Poirot thought. She let the resentment fester. He looked at her, his voice gentle. "Did you ever think Richard might do something like this?" Lady Devenham's eyes filled with tears. "No, I never thought he would hurt anyone. But I knew he was angry." Poirot placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Madame Devenham, it wasn't your fault. You couldn't have stopped it." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain. "But I should have spoken up. I should have done something." The silence, Poirot thought. It's the worst kind of mistake. He stood up. "Madame Devenham, thank you for your honesty." As he left the room, Poirot felt a deep sadness. A family torn apart by silence and resentment. It was a tragedy that went far deeper than a single murder. Chapter 12. Poirot's little grey cells stir. Poirot sat alone in the library, the quiet of the room, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded earlier. He had questioned everyone. Lady Devenham, Richard, Inspector Croft, the maid, Mr. Carter. The pieces of the puzzle were all in place. He looked at the photograph of Peter, the rose on the floor, and the decanter stopper with its faint, oily residue. The favoritism, he thought. It was the key. He remembered the argument in the garden, Sir Alister and Richard arguing about it. In all but name, Sir Alister had said. Peter is the heir. Richard couldn't bear it any more, Poirot realized. The birthday gift, the vintage car, it was the final straw. He thought about the timeline. Sir Alister retired to his study at 10:00 p.m. for his nightly brandy. Richard went into the study at 10:05, poisoned the brandy, and left. He returned to the billiards room before Mr. Carter came back. The alibi slipped, Poirot thought. The cousins stepped away during the crucial minutes. He looked at the decanter stopper again. The oily residue. Richard had oil on his hands from working on the car. He used it to poison the brandy. The means, Poirot thought. The opportunity. The motive. He stood up, his mind clear and focused. The puzzle was complete. Richard Devenham killed his father because he couldn't bear the favoritism, Poirot thought. It wasn't greed. It was love unequally given. He walked out of the library, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The truth was now known. Chapter 13. The gathering in the drawing room. Poirot stood in the drawing room, the guests and family gathered before him. Lady Devenham sat in a chair by the fireplace, her face pale and drawn. Peter stood beside her, his eyes filled with tears. Richard was being held by Inspector Croft, his face pale and haunted. Poirot cleared his throat, his voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his gaze sweeping over the room. "I have gathered you here to speak about the death of Sir Alister Devenham." A murmur of confusion rippled through the room. "I must tell you that Sir Alister was not killed by a heart attack," Poirot continued. "He was poisoned with cyanide, administered through his brandy." Lady Devenham gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Poirot looked at Richard. "Monsieur Devenham, I believe you are the killer." Richard's face crumpled. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to know." "We," Poirot said softly. "You poisoned the brandy because of the favoritism. Because your father always favored Peter over you." Richard looked at his brother. "I was tired of it, Peter. Tired of being invisible." Peter's eyes filled with tears. "Richard, I didn't know." Poirot turned to Lady Devenham. "Madame Devenham, you knew Richard resented his father for favouring Peter?" "You never spoke up." Lady Devenham nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was afraid. I thought it would only make things worse." Poirot looked around the room. The photograph of Peter on Sir Alister's desk, it was a symbol of that favoritism. Richard moved it after Sir Alister died to remind him of how much he was loved. He turned to Inspector Croft. "Inspector, please arrest Richard Devenham for the murder of Sir Alister Devenham." Croft nodded. "Richard Devenham, you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Alister Devenham." As Croft led Richard away, Poirot turned to Peter. "Monsieur Peter, I am so sorry for your loss." Peter looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot nodded, then turned to leave the room. Chapter 14. The Unmasking of Richard. As Poirot stepped out of the drawing-room, he heard Richard's voice calling out, "Monsieur Poirot, wait!" Poirot turned to see Richard straining against Croft's grip, his face pale and desperate. "Monsieur Poirot," Richard said, his voice trembling. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to know how I felt." Poirot looked at him, his expression gentle but firm. "You killed him because of the favoritism, Monsieur Devenham, because you couldn't bear it any more." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't just the car, it was everything. He never saw me. I was always invisible." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, you were invisible to him, but you weren't invisible to me." Richard looked at him, his face twisted with pain. "I loved him, but I hated him too." Love and hate, Poirot thought. They are often two sides of the same coin. He turned to Croft. "Take him away, Inspector." As Croft led Richard away, Poirot felt a deep sadness. A family torn apart by love unequally given. It was a tragedy that went far deeper than a single murder. Chapter 15. Aftermath. Poirot stood on the terrace of Devenham Hall, the cool evening air a balm to his mind. The house was quiet now, the chaos of the previous hours replaced by a heavy silence. Richard had been taken away by the police, Peter was in his room, his face pale with grief, and Lady Devenham sat alone in the drawing-room, her eyes red from crying. Poirot looked out at the garden, the roses glowing softly under the moonlight. He remembered the argument he had overheard in the garden, Sir Alistair and Richard arguing about favoritism. "In all but name," Sir Alistair had said, "Peter is the heir." Poirot sighed. The favoritism was the key. It had driven Richard to murder. It had caused Lady Devenham to remain silent. It had torn the family apart. He turned and walked back inside, his mind still working. The photograph, the rose, the oil, they were all pieces of a puzzle that had led to this moment. A family torn apart by love unequally given, Poirot thought. Not by greed, but by love. He paused in the hallway, looking at the portrait of Sir Alistair hanging on the wall. The man's face was stern, but there was a hint of kindness in his eyes. "You loved your son," Poirot thought, "but you didn't see him." He turned and walked down the hall towards the door. As he reached it, he paused one last time. "The little grey cells," he murmured to himself. "They always find the truth." He opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air. The quiet of the garden, a gentle reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. He would leave Devenham Hall, but the memory of the family torn apart by love unequally given would stay with him. And so it ends, Poirot thought, with a mystery solved and a family broken. He walked down the drive, the scent of roses filling the air, his mind already turning to the next case. But for now, he carried the weight of this tragedy with him, a reminder that even in the most perfect of families, love can be a double-edged sword. The end, he thought, but not the end of the story.